Welcome to the Writer Center's virtual craft chat series, where we talk with writers a little less about what they wrote and a little bit more about how they wrote it. My name is Zach Powers. I'm the artistic director of the Writer Center, and I'm also a novelist and fiction writer. So that's why I get the incredible honor today of speaking with Jinwoo Chong, who is the author of I'm flabbergasted by this book. I could talk about this book for days, so I'll have to give myself a hard cutoff for once. Of Flux, which is just a really great. We were using from one of the reviews used the phrase mind bending, and that's a really great description of this book. But just real quickly, if you have your book handy, do you have a brief excerpt you could share with us from just a paragraph or two up to a couple pages, so the audience here has an idea of what we'll be talking about?
Awesome, absolutely. Yes, first of all, thank you, Zach. Thank you, everybody. This is so cool to be here. I used to live in Bethesda.
Oh.
And I don't think I went to school at Georgetown, and my parents lived in Bethesda. I went there a lot. I don't know if I ever saw the building, but I should have stopped by. Maybe this book would have come out sooner if I had. At this point, I think I'm going to read the last paragraph of the book. And I don't do this. I've never read it at a reading before. I always start with like the first page or so. And I don't think it matters when in the book I read, because, maybe that's the point of this book is, the when doesn't matter. Okay, so I will read. He was not afraid. Curious, yes, he thought he was, but not afraid. He was sweating. With a smooth roll of his shoulders, he took off the jacket, holding it tenderly in his hands for a moment. He spotted a trash can on the corner of the street, took a few furtive steps toward it, then changed his mind, swinging it over one shoulder and continuing on. Naturally, the question occurred, as natural to him as though it had been inside him all along, although he never knew it had been. A question that, if he answered it, might just prove it all, might just allow him a chance at something he never had. And as he walked away from a life he was not a part of and would no longer be, just one question: what was going to happen next? There it is.
Oh. I love this. This is our first ever last paragraph reading, and so this is I think we'll get to this in some of these questions coming forward. So I'll let that sit for the moment. But so the first, in your own words, actually, the first question we like to ask in your own words: who the heck are you?
Okay, let me think. I am wearing. Oh my gosh, I should show you. I'm wearing this T-shirt that my friends got printed. And it has I can't show it. It has the cover of the book on it, and it says published author. And I think it's very obnoxious, but also quite amazing. And so, yes, now I am a published author, and that's who I am. But before, I was just an author. And before that, I was an English major. And before that, I was in the closet. I guess that's what I'll say.
All right. So the first question we like to ask about the craft of writing is to put all the pressure on you. So what's a question you really wish that someone would ask about your writing or writing practice? In other words, what haven't you gotten to speak about before that maybe you would like to speak about your writing?
I don't get asked much about revision, and I would really like to talk about it, honestly, because I think I am someone who is genuinely afraid of revising. It is really stressful to me, especially large-scale things, or, the most kind of anxiety-inducing piece of feedback, or pieces of feedback that I can imagine, are ones that say the direction of the second half of this book is troubled, or it's wrong, and you need to focus more on something else, something like that. Because then in my mind, I'm playing it out as like, Well, first of all, the whole second half of the book then would need to change, and then the whole first half of the book would have to change to set it up correctly. And it's just it snowballs into something that can be a lot of stress to deal with. And the way that I start out writing something is kind of programmed to try and eliminate as much need for revision as possible because of it. I outlined this book over 4 years. This outline became like 50 pages long. It had its own table of contents. It had tags of dialogue that I thought were interesting, character descriptions. It had links to kind of articles that I was reading about things. It had pictures. It had it had whole passages written out that I thought I felt, like I might need to add in, or I felt inspired to write at that time. And so when it came time to write the actual draft, it was actually kind of very straightforward. I wrote it front to back. Like the first word I wrote was the thing, and then I wrote chapter 2, and then 3, and then 4, and then I wrote the end. And I did it all with 2 windows open. One was the draft, and the other was this outline that I was looking at. And even so, the first person to read it seriously was my now agent, who said that there was something missing about, why the root of this main character, Brandon's obsession with television and this like idealized kind of TV figure, that was missing. And I needed to explain why it's so important to him. And it was like my stomach dropped out because I was like, oh my God, well, that's like the most important part of the book. I have to change literally everything. And what I ended up doing, because I think the actual act of going in and then jumping in and out of different paragraphs and working and cutting things and then adding things is very stressful to me. And I found myself copying something that my first ever professor at Columbia told me to do. And my professor was Sam Lipsyte, and he said that you can do just another pass. You can open a third Word doc and just kind of write the whole thing over again and see what happens. And that's what I did for most of it. I think almost every chapter in some way was rewritten in that same aspect. And so a lot of what you normally think of me like of typical revision, of going in and doing all of that, I didn't really do. I would rather scrap the whole thing or just like rewrite the entire thing of it than jump around and kind of second guess myself. And so that's basically what I did. That's probably why the revision of it took a lot longer than I thought, even though the comments that I'd gotten back on it weren't very extensive. They were big things, but they weren't, a total rehaul. But as in response to those things, I did basically a total rehaul. But I think it worked out because, I wasn't panicking during it. I felt very much in control while I was working on it.
That's fascinating on both points, the level of pre-planning you do, and then the nature of like even a what might be a moderate revision becomes a full revision. Okay, that's everyone take note of that, because I feel like, no, in a good way, that there's like, we talk about revision, we talk about these things as if they're just set processes. And it's always, I think, really good to realize that they're not set processes, that everyone ends up discovering their own process. And you might have been able to pull it off with a more normal is the wrong word, I apologize, but a more traditional, what we talk about when we talk about revision, but it's good that you didn't. I mean, certainly based on the end product, I'm pleased with whatever process you used. So it was the right one. And
it worked for me because of my own sort of personality, and I don't respond well to, I think I multitask out of necessity, but I don't like multitasking, and I would rather have, a kind of majority focus at most times, and that kind of really let me do that. So if you're like that, absolutely do it. if you're like one of those people that prints things out and loves to like throw the papers around and to draw strings and things like that, this probably isn't the right way.
That's great. Thank you. I think that was the winner for the best answer to the first question we usually ask, by the way, too. That was deep and intense. So we'll come with a trophy for you, I think, for that. It's gonna be like the Stanley Cup. We pass it around if someone else claims it, but you get it for a while, yeah.
I'll give you my shipping address.
Yeah. So this is actually a question I usually tuck in at the end, just like as if I have some extra time and I want to get to this. But in your case, I wanted to ask it up front, which is on influences, because I really do feel like this is a novel that's maybe proud of its influences. Even the title is related in the text back to the Future, the flux of the flux capacitor. So we're getting an influence. So what books, and particularly maybe other media in this case, do you consider your book to be in conversation with?
When I think of the conversation, because of who I'm thinking of and which books I'm thinking of, it is not so much a conversation. It's honestly like they're on a stage and my book is like in the audience, perhaps asking a question. Like that's the level that I sort of envision. But it's I thought a lot about the sympathizer. I think when I am asked what is my favorite book, I usually say Viet Thanh Nguyen and the Sympathizer, because of its complexity and it's just it is truly like the most thrilling literary book I've ever read. And there are a few books that win those like really like famous uppity prizes and things like that that have this energy about them to me, and that's why I like it so much. Viet Thanh Nguyen speaks a lot about how the narrator of The Sympathizer is inspired by Ellison and Invisible Man, and both of those characters are the narrators of their own stories. They have no name. They have very little that distinguishes them. Ellison's main character is Black, and that's basically all you know. Viet Thanh Nguyen's main character is Vietnamese, and that's basically all you know. And that really spoke to me. The character Brandon in this book is very much me trying to create somebody like that who is kind of like spy-like and is able to blend into things and walk between worlds because of some level of anonymity that he has. And I love that about those characters and about Brandon. I was also thinking a lot about Interior Chinatown, which I think that one's pretty evident just because it's like television and all of those things. But the way that Charles Yu sort of created this show within a book was something that really kind of inspired me and energized me. I've never seen television rendered like that in writing or in text. And it kind of pushed me in the direction of putting a lot of stock into the Radar show, which was not honestly a very big thing. It wasn't supposed to be as big of an influence on the book or on Brandon as it turned out to be. And writing that show and writing like the random things that happened and the various recollections of those episodes was the most fun part of writing the whole book. And so it took on a life of its own. Those are probably the big ones. I love everything Ling Ma does. And I read Bliss Montage after finishing Flux. And I really just got it. The main character of her novel Severance is this young woman kind of forced to do all of this stuff that, she doesn't really want to do, but she does it anyway. And it's like this perfect portrayal of what I feel like it's like to be a person in their 20s, like laboring under capitalism currently. And she captures it so impressively. And that character exists in many forms in all of the stories in Bliss Montage as well. And I felt very, very captured by that as well.
I mean, definitely the interior Chinatown, but that one popped in my head, obviously, but also, well, there's obviously a connection between the two. They're so different too, which is also a wonderful thing that there's nothing at all derivative in your book from interior Chinatown, even though you can draw some lines between them. So and it's really fascinating to know that the TV show. So for those who haven't read the book yet, there is a TV show within the book that plays a major part, and it's such. I mean, there's so much flavor of the novel comes from that. So it's really exciting to hear that wasn't in the original recipe, at least not to the quantity wasn't in the original. You up the number of tablespoons as you went around, because it's certainly an interesting flavor in that whole mix you have going on there. Because there's lots of stuff going on, but that one sort of ends up tying across the different bounces because it is a fragmented novel. So across the different bounces, this does occur sort of in all of them, and becomes more tangible even than in the form of the jacket as it comes along. So I'm doing the thing I try never to, which is do an analysis live on camera. I'm going to stop right now and move to my next question.
It's perfect.
So there is a you in some of these sections, and it is not, though, a second person thing at all. And we actually had Marissa Crane on. I believe you did an event with Marissa Crane not too long ago. So we had her on for one of these chats as well. And her novel also has this kind of view. And I think she used the term called first person direct response, in which you have a first person narrator who is occasionally directing a you at a specific person. In the case of Marissa's book, it's a deceased spouse. In the case of your book, it's actually a television character. And that's really, really fascinating to me. Can you tell us a little bit about this point of view? And especially now that we know that it maybe wasn't as much of a part of the story originally as it is in this final draft published version. Tell us a little bit about the point of view and how it came about, and why did you choose it, and why do you think it grew in terms of its place in the novel?
Oh, totally. The writing those parts in which Brandon is having these kind of completely one-sided discussions with a fictional character are so useful, because it let me kind of telegraph everything that was going on inside him, without needing to have him talk to someone, and without needing to just say I and do all of that, which had been done, or it was being used in different ways throughout the book. So I wanted to try something different. When I was trying to come up with things that would make Brandon unique, one of the things was that he would be this kind of TV, like Reddit nerd and kind of creeper who would just, was so like someone who's obsessed with everything Star Wars, like that kind of thing, and goes to Comic-Con and like knows the entire extended canon, all of that. Like, I loved the character. I wanted the character to have something like that, and an obsession. And it wasn't enough afterwards for him to just casually reference Raider. He demanded, more space, because if it's such a big part of this person's life, which I didn't expect it to be, he takes up space. And the way that I came about this, what Marissa said, first person direct address, is that I think everybody has a repartee with someone in their lives, and this happens in their head. It could be a fictional character like it is for Brandon. It could be like a personification of, your mother or your grandparents, or like your best friend, or someone that you talk to and just kind of perform against internally, so that you can understand a little bit more about yourself. And I don't think everybody does it to the extent that Brandon does, because his is bordering on like kind of parasocial, unhealthy, that kind of thing. Although there are lots of people that have that, and you see it displayed, in the way that they talk, and the way that they like post on Twitter and things like that. You see that, and it's very apparent. And it was just really fascinating to me to work with that, because Brandon is his most honest when he's talking to Raider, And it was important for me that you see that, because he does a lot of shitty things in the book, and I really did not want him to be someone that you rooted against, or that you couldn't feel sorry for, or in any way feel compassion for. I needed people to see that he was a good person, and that he had just, as a result of the way that he was, had so much difficulty expressing himself to anyone that wasn't this kind of fiction inside his head.
Yeah, I mean, and it works so well on a literary level. I mean, it works so well in literature, and it makes this thing so compelling to follow that. It leads to such interesting thought processes. It leads to interesting moments of language. It leads to so many interesting elements like that. So it really, anytime I got a U, I was really excited. Like, oh, we're talking to Raider again. Let me see what's going on. That was like always got my attention. But I was enjoying the evidence of it seemed that you enjoyed writing those sections also came out, and that leads a little bit to I guess my next couple questions were about play, and I think sometimes play and is frowned upon by some elements of the literary establishment, that we must be serious at all times. But I value play. I value writing that has a sense of play. Do you feel yourself having a sense of play? Was some of that sense? Did that sense, was it heightened when you're writing in this point of view where you had the first person direct address? I have to look up that terminology every time. I can never remember it. And in general, is the novel, do you feel like you're having some fun with the novel, so to speak? Or is there an element of play in those sections? Is there an element of play throughout that you found yourself leaning into or using to sustain the writing?
Mm-hmm. The show and everything that pertained to it was where I was basically the only time in writing it that I was like actively having fun, because it's so rewarding and interesting to just create and also like emulate the style of a Wikipedia plot summary and do all of that. This kind of weird, sort of very obsessive but detailed style that I think everybody's read a Wikipedia summary of like a scary movie, or what happened next on The Mandalorian. Like everyone's reading that. Everybody knows that kind of language, and it was really kind of joyous to do that, because I could do anything I wanted in the realm of that show. I was not really having fun writing any of the rest of it, because it was dealing with topics that were pretty dark and pretty personal as well. And I don't know, I think some people might have, I can't imagine like memoirists don't have fun talking about their own personal stories and kind of interrogating them in that way. I don't really have fun doing that. And so everything except the show, I don't think I had much play in it. And it might just be because of the subject matter, but also because I knew that, there needed to actually be a difference between the real world and the world of the show. And the tone had to be so kind of dissonant that you would just feel transported as you crossed over from one to the other. And in successive chapters, that happens more and more chaotically. And I was really kind of focused on creating disorientation through that.
Great. So a few questions coming in the chat now, so I'm going to turn that direction for a moment. First question is, what do you wish for your readers to have left with after finishing your novel? Tough one.
I think that there is a certain moment that I think occurs a lot in work that includes elements of time travel or conflicting timelines and things like that, where in 1 second, everything makes sense. And for that brief second, everything does. And it's almost like, at the eye doctor, when all of those lenses kind of swing down in front of you and everything just zeroes into focus. I love that moment in fiction. And I am constantly kind of in pursuit of recreating those moments. I think there's a couple in this book that hopefully kind of convey that sense of like just shock when it happens. And I would hope that people walk away from those feeling just like, what the hell happened just now? And because that's what I was going for. And those are the things in books and movies and television that are the most fun for me to experience. And so I hope it's the most fun for people to kind of get while reading this book.
I love the metaphor of the eye doctor, like little lens machine, and the right combination of lenses coming to focus. I mean, I suddenly started picturing like the different pieces of your novel being different lenses being flipped and flipped and flipped until they all. So this novel, I don't know, what's that? Does that device have a name? Do we need to learn? I don't know. I actually have no idea what that device is called.
Yeah, we're gonna have
okay.
to.
We're gonna have to research this. But we'll have a sequel to this talk where we just to define that one, to come with the right term for that. But yeah, I mean, I now like looking at your novel in terms of that and just seeing the little lenses flipping and flipping and flipping and flipping until the right ones happen to hit. So yes, if that was your goal, you absolutely achieved it, because that is such a perfect metaphor for how the novel works.
I'm very glad. It wasn't enough to convince the Washington Post. They wrote, "There's a lot going on," to varying success. And that was the headline of their review. And I felt at first like, I don't care. And then I was like, wait a minute, like that was the crux of, oh, that's perfect. A bifocular. Okay. That's quite nice. Yeah.
Well, as the Post is our hometown paper, we will have words with them. We're not going to let that stand unchallenged. So
I do hope so. I mean, I work at the New York Times on the business side, and I posted that review to everybody there. And of course, everybody at the Times has long-standing hatred of the Post, just as rivals. And so it was quite nice to bask in that.
Well, I can't claim to hate the Post, because I think we have to be friendly with them, but I will claim to hate that review and think they've missed the point. So yeah, words are coming. I'm gonna find another review. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Back to the chat window. How did you develop your writing process? Had you tried other approaches before and settled on the outlining and drafting approach, or has that just been there all along?
The outlining seems to have been a habit I formed way long ago. And that was because I could never decide on what I wanted to do. So I'd say, okay, let me outline it and see if it's a good idea. And from that was born this crazy sort of process in which it got more and more complicated and things like that. And this book is very twisty. A lot of things have to be paid attention to, and it required an outline for that. I think I've been doing that just honestly forever. The revision process, I just, it was probably that one conversation. I actually think that a lot of my editing and sort of revising style came out of my MFA, because truth be told, I didn't really revise before then. And because I had nobody to tell me what to fix. I was just writing, on my computer for myself. And once I got into a place where I finally had like a writing circle and a community, I started seeing, or people started pointing out things, or various recurrent flaws or tropes that I like to do for the first time in my whole life. And from there, I had to learn how to kind of accommodate those things, how to see it in myself, and to try and figure it out. And I got lucky because Sam Lipsyte's workshop was the first one I ever took, and he was an exceptional professor and continues to be.
That's an amazing first workshop.
Oh yeah, he was the first person to blurb the book as well, and I sent him this like extremely long email referencing every book he's ever written, and was just very acting as if I didn't spend an entire semester with him, because that's the polite thing to do. And then he wrote back and said, like, sure, here's my address. It was like the night he's an amazing person and such a generous sort of writer. But because it was my first workshop, I didn't really, after that, there were lots of suggestions as to what I could do. But as I kept going along, the one that was suggested to me first was always the one that was most effective. And so through like trial and error, I chose that one. And now I rewrite and rewrite constantly. And it's almost like my habit that I can't control so much anymore.
I mean, I should mention too, we did a chat with Matt Bell when his Refuse to Be Done craft book came out, and his craft book would align somewhat with your process a little bit too, which is just tons of work. And the more work you put in terms of the more time you rewrite things, the more times you rewrite things, the more polished, the closer you're going to get to the thing you want at the end.
Yeah.
And he definitely has some giant rewrite section. He also has some traditional revision processes, but he does have like just do it again, the whole do it again phase, which is interesting.
Yeah.
So if you're interested in this kind of thing, definitely check out that book, Refuse to Be Done by Matt Bell. Back to the chat window. Do you develop characters before plot or vice versa? And how did that work with this novel in particular?
I would say plot comes first all the time, because I don't think I am good enough to write a book that is like the voice of someone living their life, or if it's a day, if it's a weekend, and that's what sustains it. I am definitely not good enough to do something like that. And the one that I can point to that I thought was exceptionally done was by Ryan Lee Wong. It came out earlier this year, and it was called Whose Side Are You On? And it's a series of basic conversations that this young Asian American college student has with his mostly mother, who was once kind of like this radical liberal like activist. It's just the conversations, and it was riveting the entire time. And now it's won all sorts of prizes. He's won all sorts of accolades, and for good reason. And I just am not wired for that. And I know that I'm sure when books like that are conceived of, they start with the character, because that's what you see in the final product, is just this very intimate portrait of a person. I kind of go, I guess, the opposite way. And I think about one of the first things I thought about was the ends of part 1 and 2 were the first things I thought about, because those two are two of the bifocular moments that happen. And I had to figure those out first for everything else to make sense. And so, yeah, I'm very plot driven, and a lot of people hate that and say that that's wrong, but that's basically the only way I can write books. Otherwise, I wouldn't be writing books.
There's no right or wrong. Also, like, I mean, and you said, you wouldn't be good enough. I don't think it's an issue of being good enough. I mean, there are people who can write super character stuff who couldn't flip the switch so we all have our own like set of skills that allow us to create the finished novel product. So anyway, there's diversity of approaches, diversity of things. So it's always helpful to hear different approaches to find the one that suits you. But yeah. I'm not going to let you denigrate yourself with not good enough.
That's true. I was talking to a friend, Vanessa Chan, who is next year going to be like as big as anyone could ever be, because her book is being published in 20 languages all over, like all of that. I was telling her about my book and the fact that Ling Ma was potentially going to read it and blurb it. And I was saying like, and if she doesn't hate it, maybe I've got a chance or something like that. And Vanessa looked at me with disgust and said like, what is this energy? Obviously, if you have this energy, then she's not going to read it and she's not going to blurb it. So you have to fix yourself. And that has stuck with me a lot. But I just did it in this talk, and so I'm continuing to learn. I'm continuing to change.
Modesty's good, but yeah. The chat window is rocking tonight, so I'm going to stay over there for the moment. So we talked about play earlier. So when engaged in play, how do you know when to push it, make it stranger, or to rein the impulse in? That's a good question.
I kind of led with a rule of thumb of if it got close to Brandon's family life, which was sort of the thing about him that was his personhood, and the thing that the most important part of the book, which is his place within his family and what he sees of himself in there. If I got close to that, I kind of backed off from the play element, because I needed to strike a very kind of serious tone with those things, so that someone reading it would not mistake the core of the book for what I wanted the core of the book to be. As we got further from it, as we're doing stuff like the show, the company, and the absolutely ridiculous people that are employed at this company that say just like whatever comes to mind, that way I could do whatever I want, because they were kind of on the fringes of it. And the tone could be a little bit more playful out there, because I wasn't talking about the most important part of the book. But that's just the way that I chose, because I was the only part of the book that I was protective over was the core of it, which was Brandon, his father, and his little brother, and the way that this family unit kind of had to come together after a very kind of traumatic loss. And that part I needed to do kind of solemnly, I guess is the word for it. Everything else, I entertained, basically whatever I thought of, but I had to strike a difference between the two.
I love to use the word solemn, because I sometimes personally balk at the word serious, because I think there's just between seriousness and respectfulness, I guess. Like I believe good comedy writing is respectful of what it's doing, even though you wouldn't call it being serious. But solemn, I think, is a really interesting word to me, because that's like recognizing that, okay, I'm not going to be playing games in this section because I have to be. The subject is solemn, the writing has to be solemn, and the process has to have some of that solemnity too going on, or it's not going to work. It's not going to come off if you don't get in that headspace when you're doing the work. So that's really interesting to me. Totally. All right. Next from the chat, I'm going to come back to the first part of this question, and I'll go to the second part of the question, which is, do you think the MFA experience helped you in the draft and process for this novel?
Oh.
The MFA question.
Let me say that the MFA itself was a lot less helpful than the span of time that the MFA took up, because the best part of the program for me was to be alone, to not have a job, and to just be able to focus on this one thing. And that took precedence over the workshops or the advice or this kind of sense of community between all of the students and things like that. And I knew that going in. And I knew that because I knew that I was being distracted by my day job and by just everything around me. And that was what was preventing me from really kind of sitting down and figuring out how to actually put this book together. I know for a lot of people, the MFA is about finding your community, or finding your sort of your writing circle and finding friends and things like that. I was a quarter way through this program when the pandemic hit, and we did everything through Zoom. And so that was kind of not an option in the same way that it would have been if it were in person. And so I kind of threw myself into trying to find the positive in this immense isolation and this kind of abundance of time that I had on my hands. So I am of the school of thought that says the MFA is time to write, and that's the most important thing. And I believe that because that is the reason why the book exists.
Thank you. So next question in the chat is one I actually really like and one I think about a lot, which is, how do you balance suspending readers' understanding of what's going on here, being disoriented, with giving them enough structure to stick with the story, not getting frustrated?
It is my vice, honestly. It's my Moby Dick, is trying to do that, because it's the one thing that every sort of middling, mixed review of this book has mentioned, is that, and also when this book was being rejected left and right by editors when it was on submission, that was the one thing people said, is that I'm too suspended. Like I don't have things to touch or to put footholds on in order to understand things. And so I know that that's like a thing that typically happens when reading a book like this, that it's confusing. And I guess to answer that, if I knew how to make it less confusing and to guide people in a better way, I would have done it. And so the focus, I've sort of realized, couldn't exactly come from me. It had to come from someone I trusted who was reading it. And so I found myself leaning on a select group of people from my MFA, my agent, and then some very trusted friends. And I said, I don't care about anything else. Just let me know when you know what's happening and when the disorientation is too uncomfortable. And I went from there. Because when you spend so much time with something, especially the way that I outlined this, I knew every twist, every turn, every point. And so it was the clearest thing in the world for me. And so how I could have never figured out what actually was confusing, because I had such inside knowledge. And so I feel like in that way, I had to lean on people outside of myself and outside of any awareness of the book, so that I could figure out the trends. And that's really all I could do, honestly.
That's great. I mean, I was never confused, so I'm just gonna. I would say I was never confused, except in points where I thought it was intentional that I was going to learn something in the future. And I love that, like the clues there for me to know that that's an important thing, is you can have someone confused as long as the clues are there to let them know that the confusion is going to be relieved at some point. That there's the author gives you the wink and the nudge, like, hey, stick with me, we'll get there. We're not there yet. And I thought that was handled really great throughout. So, and anybody who passed on this book and any reviewers were just terribly wrong and careless readers. But so we had a question about how do you find your publisher, Melville House, and not a purely craft question, but I think it's one that we all want to hear. I mean, my novel was on submission for like a year, so I've certainly been on that boat too. So how did you find Melville House and your agent, and how did this whole process go down?
Oh yes, the finding my agent was the most exciting period of my life, because it felt like all the validation that I was searching for, because it took about 10 days. I had basically just left the program. I was querying for the first time. I'd already spoken with my agent, Danielle, previously, because she'd found, stories I'd written and asked to see a novel. So I knew that she would at least read the book when it was done. I sent it to her and a couple of others. Responses back like you wouldn't believe, like within 24 hours, within a day, stuff like that. It felt like, oh my God, I finally made it. Like, this is when it begins. My submission process was the exact opposite, and it literally broke me in every way, because it was months and months of not even close calls. it was full-on rejections. Just like, I don't identify with this. This is confusing. We would not, a couple of people said, we don't see the imprint publishing something like this, stuff like that. And just months and months, every week, Danielle would email me, these people passed. We did 3 rounds of submissions. And I was very close to giving up. It was just honestly like, it wasn't worth the pain after a while, because it had started to make me dislike the book. It had started to make me think, well, I don't think, surely everybody, all of these editors who read all of this must be right about it. I was entertaining some very tough thoughts. I knew of Melville House through Twitter. I knew one of their editors had just randomly followed me one day, and I went down a rabbit hole of where she worked and things like that. I suggested to Danielle, why don't we try Melville House for around 3 submissions? And then like 5 months later, out of the blue, my now editor, Carl, emailed and said he might be making an offer. And I heard that. I was running around like talking to anybody I knew, like, who that says might be making an offer? Like, what does that even mean? And I was freaking out for another 2 weeks. And then they made that offer. And it was the only one I got. And they were the last ones. Everybody else had already closed out. And so it was not only meant to be, but it was my only option that turned out to be the best thing in the world. Because every step of this process, publishing this book with them, has been a wonderful surprise. It was going to be paperback at first. We got enough pre-orders that they made it a hardcover. It was not going to have an audiobook. And then a bunch of reviews came out, and then they were able to sublease the audio to somebody else. I was going to, I think, maybe not even have a launch because I couldn't really find someone to do it with. And then the publicist at Melville happened to know someone at the Strand who she sold on the book. Just every single thing worked out for the best because of them. And it never would have happened if, somebody else early on had offered. And so I'm so grateful for it, because a lot of people can say like, I was the one who did it, or I am responsible for all of this, but were it not for them, the book wouldn't exist because it would have been rejected by everybody. And so I owe them everything. It was like it's the relationship with the publisher that everybody kind of wishes for. And I got it. And I'm extremely lucky to have experienced that.
I think there's a really good moral to the story too, which is the publishing industry isn't always that great at what they do. And obviously there was potential for this book that a bunch of editors and publishers just absolutely failed to realize. That the book got a lot of buzz, it got a lot of interest, it got a lot of, once it was out there and something people would see, and certainly Melville House did a great job from top to bottom, it sounds like. But yeah, people just like, editors are people, and they're also people you mentioned capitalist systems. They're in a very capitalist system, and their number one thing is, I need this book to sell enough copies so I don't get fired. And the easiest way to do that is a book that looks like a book they know has already sold a lot of copies. And so when your book doesn't look like that, suddenly you're facing an uphill battle, but then it's vision. You have to find the right person, the right vision for the thing that doesn't fit the mold. And if you find that person, then they're going to run with it in a way, and it gets noticed because it got the right audience, got the right media, got the right placement. Anyway, so I'm loving this success story. I'm loving this. I'm glad it worked out this way. But again, it's good for people to hear too. It's like, if you have the weird thing, you're going to get some no's along the way, because the weird thing is always going to be balked at by people who are trying to find a place for it. So yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. We have time for a couple more before we're done. And one more from the chat, and then I'll maybe go to our last question. How much does poetry factor into your writing practice? Do you read, study poetry to feed into your work?
I wish I did. The best writers of novels, in my opinion, are poets. And I can point to like Ocean Vuong for one. I think, okay, so best writer, I think I'm speaking as most masterful with their phrases, with their building, all of that. He's up there for me. And it's just like, it's breathtaking what poets do when they write prose. And it leads me to think I should read more poetry, but I also think that poetry is one of the only things that I respond to more when it's spoken rather than when it's written. I don't really enjoy audiobooks. Like I find myself when I'm watching a play getting very distracted because of random things, and I would much rather just read the script, things like that. Poetry is total opposite. When I hear poets recite their own work, it's like I'm experiencing a completely different thing. And I guess it's part of the reason that like I tried to read everything aloud from this book when I was trying to emulate what that was like and figure out, what I was responding to. And so I guess actually it is the performance of poetry that inspires me and figures a lot into my writing more than just the words themselves. And I would rather, and it's something that I wish I would do more often.
So first, subscribe to Poet Lore, and twice a year you'll get 40 to 50 new poems to read from the best contemporary poets. Amy is frantically looking at our links document. Put the link for Poet Lore back up. Thank you, Amy. Secondly, we had Patricia Lockwood and Ming Chang for previous craft chats, both of whom began in poetry, and both of whom, if you read their stuff, like, oh yeah, you're better at words than I am, and it's because you spent so much time just focusing on words. So yeah, absolutely, that's a good point. There've been some, and Ocean for sure too. We haven't had him for an event, but that book's just stunning.
I would also put Max Porter in with that.
I've not read Max Porter, so I will add to the list.
Oh yes, I think his first book was called "Grief is the Thing with Feathers."
Actually, I have it on my shelf. I already have the book. I've not read it, so this is as soon as I'm not home. So as soon as I get home, I will pull that off the shelf and maybe move that to top of my list. All right, so we're at the end of our time, but I do want to throw in our final question, and it's the reason I skipped the first half of the earlier question. So the final question is, what's one piece of advice you give to a writer just starting out? And the other question was just advice for new writers. So a single piece of advice and maybe any just broad advice you have for new writers.
Okay, I think it is that everybody here, everybody on this call, and every writer ever has achievements that they can point to, no matter where they are in their career. And as you ascend and you achieve more, those things in your past tend to disappear, and you stop recognizing their existence. And that is dumb. And everybody should stop doing that because it is poisonous. I found myself doing this because what I was talking about, the Washington Post review came out, and that day I was like, wow, that really sucks. Like, I feel terrible about that. And 2 days ago, I had gotten a rave in the New York Times book review, and I literally was ignoring that happened. Like, it didn't exist for me in that moment. And it is everybody's knee-jerk reaction to that. Whether, even if you haven't published, maybe you finished something that you're really proud of. Maybe someone like has read even a piece of it and said it was good, or maybe you're even proud of like a sentence that you've written that you think is really just eloquent and amazing. Like, everybody, you have to hold your achievements close to you because everybody has them. And the belief that you have yet to achieve something is false. Everybody has them. And the only way to stop yourself from kind of falling into like this black hole as you get higher and higher in your career is to remember that.
Amazing. Well, Jinwoo, thank you so much for joining us. Right now, I would hold up the book again if I were at home and had my copy, but please buy a copy of the book.
Here we go. And then here's me on the back.
So please buy a copy of the book. Please join us again for a craft chat. Jinwoo, again, thank you so much for joining us. This has been absolutely outstanding. I've learned things. I hope everyone else here has too. And someone just started a lawnmower right behind us.
Thank you so much, Zach. Thank you, Amy, and thank you, everyone. Thank you, the Writer Center.